"Security, please escort this confused gentleman to the lobby," Michael announced loudly across the crowded trading floor of Peterson Financial Group, his voice dripping with theatrical authority. I think he wandered in from the wrong building. 30 pairs of eyes turned toward me as I stood in my simple khakis and polo shirt, surrounded by young professionals in $1,000 suits. The security guard was already approaching, his hand moving toward my elbow like I was some vagrant who'd stumbled into their sacred space. "Sir, you'll need to come with me," the guard said firmly, loud enough for everyone to hear. The laughter started as a few nervous chuckles from the younger associates, but it quickly spread across the open office like wildfire. Here was their entertainment for the afternoon, the poor old fool who'd somehow made it past the front desk. "Probably looking for the community center," someone whispered, triggering another wave of laughter. Michael stood behind his desk with his arms crossed, wearing that satisfied smile I'd seen too many times lately. He was enjoying every second of my public humiliation, orchestrating it like a conductor leading his orchestra of cruelty. But he had no idea that this performance was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. And that was only the beginning. I should have noticed the first sign 3 weeks earlier when Michael started treating me like a charity case at Laura's birthday dinner. The entire evening, he'd made little comments about my simple lifestyle and conservative choices, each one designed to chip away at my dignity in front of the family. "Dad's from a different generation," he'd told our guests with that condescending laugh. "Back then, people thought keeping money in mattresses was smart financial planning." Everyone had chuckled politely while I sat there, quietly enduring the humiliation. Laura had squeezed my hand under the table, but she hadn't defended me. She never did when Michael was performing. That was when I realized he was building a narrative about me. The confused old man who needed guidance. The financially naive retiree who couldn't handle modern complexities. Each public comment was another brick in the wall he was constructing around my reputation. "You know, Dad, you should really let Michael take a look at your finances," Laura had suggested later that night. "He's so good with numbers, and honestly, you could probably use the help." The words had cut deep because they came from my own daughter, but I'd said nothing. Sometimes silence reveals more about people than confrontation ever could. Michael was poisoning my relationship with Laura, one patronizing comment at a time. But what he didn't understand was that I'd been watching him too, cataloging every assumption, every calculated cruelty. The phone call changed everything when Michael invited me to his office for what he called a professional consultation. His voice had an excited energy that should have warned me, like a predator who'd finally cornered his prey. "Dad, I want you to see what real wealth management looks like. Come to my office tomorrow afternoon. I'll introduce you to my team, show you how professionals handle serious money." The way he emphasized serious money made it clear he didn't think I had any. In Michael's mind, I was just another confused retiree with a modest savings account and outdated ideas about investing. "I've already told my colleagues about you," he continued. "They're excited to meet you. It'll be educational for everyone involved." That phrase, educational for everyone involved, should have triggered every warning bell in my head, but I was curious to see just how far Michael was willing to go with his performance. What he didn't know was that Charles Morrison had built Morrison Capital Management from nothing, turning a small regional firm into a billion-dollar investment powerhouse. I'd spent 30 years managing portfolios that dwarfed Peterson Financial Group's entire client base. But I'd retired quietly, without fanfare, content to let younger men chase recognition while I enjoyed the anonymity of a simple suburban life. Michael had seen that simplicity and mistaken it for ignorance. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. But the real shock came later that night when I realized exactly what kind of show Michael was planning. That Tuesday afternoon felt like walking into a coliseum when I arrived at Peterson Financial Group for the second time. The entire 14th floor seemed to be waiting for me. 30-plus junior associates and senior staff members who'd apparently heard about the afternoon's entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Michael announced as I stepped off the elevator, "I'd like you to meet the star of our educational session today. My wife's father has graciously agreed to let us demonstrate the difference between amateur hour and professional wealth management." The laughter was immediate and widespread. Someone in the back called out, "How much are we talking about? Thousands?" "Try hundreds," Michael replied with theatrical timing. "Maybe a low 5 figures if we're lucky." Classic case of Depression-era thinking meets modern financial reality. More laughter, louder now. I could see people pulling out their phones, recording what they clearly expected to be a memorable performance. A young woman near the front whispered to her colleague, "This is better than the compliance training videos." Michael was glowing with the attention, feeding off the crowd's energy like a comedian working his audience. Dad here thinks keeping money in savings accounts is still a viable strategy in 2023. Tonight I'm going to show him what happens when professionals take over. The applause was enthusiastic. Michael had turned my presence into theater, and I was the unwitting star of his show. But I had no idea what was coming next would make this humiliation look gentle by comparison. But the real shock came later that afternoon when Michael decided to turn his cruelty into performance art. We'd moved to the main trading floor where the entire office could witness what he called his masterclass in client education. "Now watch this, everyone," Michael announced, positioning himself center stage. "Dad, why don't you tell my colleagues about your investment strategy?" I started to speak, but Michael cut me off with a theatrical wave of his hand. "Let me translate for everyone. Dad here keeps his retirement money in savings accounts because he doesn't trust the stock market. Isn't that right, Dad?" The crowd was eating it up. Someone shouted, "What's his rate of return, 2%? "Try 0.5%, Michael replied, triggering an explosion of laughter. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the poster child for financial illiteracy, the poor old fool who thinks inflation is just a fancy word bankers made up." The phrase, "poor old fool," hit the room like a punchline to a joke everyone had been waiting for. The laughter was deafening now, with people actually applauding Michael's performance. "Can someone please call security?" a voice called from the back. "I think this gentleman wandered in from the Medicaid office downstairs." More laughter, more applause. Michael was basking in the attention, his chest puffed out with pride at how thoroughly he was destroying me in front of his peers. But I just stood there quietly, waiting for the perfect moment to end his career forever. And that was only the beginning of his complete destruction. And that was only the beginning of Michael's catastrophic miscalculation, though he had no idea the trap was already closing around him. The crowd of 30-plus associates was still buzzing with laughter when a distinguished older man in a hand-tailored suit emerged from the executive elevator. The room's energy shifted immediately. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Junior associates straightened their postures and tried to look busy. This was clearly someone important, someone whose attention you didn't want to attract for the wrong reasons. Michael's demeanor transformed instantly from comedian to eager subordinate. "Mr. Harrison, perfect timing, sir. I was just conducting an educational demonstration about the importance of professional wealth management." The man Michael had called Harrison surveyed the scene with sharp executive eyes. The crowd of laughing employees, the phones recording, the obvious spectacle being made of an elderly visitor. "Michael," Harrison said slowly, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decades of commanding rooms like this one. "What exactly is happening here?" Michael puffed up with pride, clearly thinking his boss would appreciate his initiative. "Sir, I'm showing the team what happens when amateur investors try to manage their own portfolios. This is my father-in-law. Classic case of a financially illiterate retiree who needs professional guidance." The crowd chuckled, waiting for their senior partner to join in the joke. But Harrison wasn't laughing. His eyes had locked onto my face with an intensity that made several people in the room shift uncomfortably. "And what's your name, sir?" Harrison asked me directly, his voice carefully neutral. I had no idea what was coming next, but I could see recognition starting to dawn in his eyes like a slow-motion explosion. I had no idea what was coming next when I quietly said, "Charles Morrison." But the effect was like detonating a bomb in the middle of the trading floor. Harrison's face went completely white, then red, then white again as the full implications hit him. The name Charles Morrison traveled through the crowd like an electric shock. I could see it hitting different people at different speeds. First the senior associates who'd been in the business long enough to recognize the name, then the junior staff as whispers spread like wildfire. "Charles Morrison," Harrison repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Charles Morrison who founded Morrison Capital Management?" The room had gone absolutely silent. 30-plus people frozen in place, phones still recording, but now capturing something entirely different than what they'd expected. "Charles Morrison," a senior associate breathed from somewhere in the crowd, "wrote the portfolio theory textbook we studied in business school. He managed over $2 billion in assets," another voice added, awed. Michael was looking around the room in growing panic, still not understanding but clearly sensing that everything had gone catastrophically wrong. "Sir, I don't understand. That's just Dad. He's a retiree. He shops at regular stores." Harrison turned to address the entire floor, his voice carrying with the authority of someone making the most important announcement of his career. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are looking at one of the most respected names in the investment management industry. Charles Morrison built Morrison Capital from a two-person firm into one of the most successful investment houses on the East Coast." The silence was deafening. You could literally hear the air conditioning. But the real shock came later that night when the full weight of Michael's career suicide became clear. That morning, something felt wrong when I'd agreed to this office visit, but I hadn't anticipated witnessing Michael's complete professional annihilation in real time. Harrison was still addressing the stunned crowd, his voice growing stronger as the full scope of the situation became clear. Charles Morrison's firm managed pension funds for 3 states and investment portfolios for Fortune 500 companies. Harrison continued, his tone becoming increasingly grim. "He's been featured on the cover of Financial Times, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and Investment Weekly. The diversification strategies we teach in our training program are based on methodologies he pioneered." The whispers were starting now, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People were pulling out their phones, frantically Googling my name. I could see their faces changing as the search results loaded. Shock, awe, professional mortification. "He sold Morrison Capital 5 years ago for $800 million, Harrison added, each word hitting Michael like a physical blow. "He could buy Peterson Financial Group with his pocket change." Michael looked like he was going to vomit. His face had gone gray, and he was swaying slightly on his feet. Around us, his colleagues were staring at him with a mixture of horror and disgust. "That's impossible," Michael whispered, but his voice carried in the absolute silence. "He lives in a regular house. He drives an old Honda. He shops at Walmart." "Because," I said quietly, my voice carrying across the trading floor, "real wealth doesn't need to prove itself to anyone." The impact of those words was immediate. Several of the junior associates actually stepped back, as if physical distance could somehow reduce their association with Michael's humiliation. But the real shock came later that night when Harrison made the decision that would end not just Michael's career, but his entire future in the financial industry. But the real shock came later that afternoon, when Harrison made the decision that would haunt Michael for the rest of his career. We were standing in Harrison's corner office, overlooking the trading floor, where 30 people were still buzzing about what they'd witnessed. "Mr. Morrison," Harrison said, his voice heavy with professional mortification, "what happened down there is the most egregious breach of professional conduct I've witnessed in 25 years in this business." Through the glass wall, I could see Michael standing exactly where we'd left him, surrounded by colleagues who were now treating him like he had a contagious disease. Several people were openly filming him with their phones, documenting his complete destruction for posterity. "You have to understand," Harrison continued, "calling any client a poor old fool would be grounds for immediate termination. But calling Charles Morrison a poor old fool," he shook his head in disbelief, "that's career suicide on a level I've never seen. He's been pressuring me for weeks to transfer my assets to his management," I explained quietly. "He's told my daughter that I'm financially incompetent, that I need professional guidance to avoid making costly mistakes. Today was supposed to be his final push to get control of my portfolio." Harrison's expression darkened. "He was trying to acquire you as a client while publicly mocking your intelligence?" "Exactly. And now you understand what kind of advisor he really is." When we returned to the trading floor, the entire office was waiting. Every phone was out. Every conversation had stopped. They all knew what was coming. The execution was swift and merciless. Harrison's voice carried across the entire floor as he delivered the verdict that everyone had seen coming from the moment my identity was revealed. But I had no idea what was coming next would make Michael's termination look like a gentle warning. And that was only the beginning of the consequences that would follow Michael for the rest of his career, though the immediate result was devastating enough. Harrison's voice cut through the silence of the trading floor like a judge delivering a death sentence. "Michael Patterson, your employment with Peterson Financial Group is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building within the next 5 minutes." The reaction was swift and brutal. Gasps from the crowd, phones capturing every moment, the sound of Michael's breathing becoming rapid and shallow. Several junior associates were already backing away from him, distancing themselves from the toxic cloud that now surrounded his reputation. "Sir, please, I can explain," Michael began. But Harrison cut him off with the authority of someone who'd made this decision final. "You called Charles Morrison, one of the most respected names in our industry, a poor old fool while trying to con him into giving you control of his assets. You turned a potential client meeting into a public humiliation spectacle for your own entertainment. There's nothing to explain." The whispers were starting again, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Word was already traveling through the building, through other floors, through other firms. In the age of smartphones and social media, Michael's career suicide had just been broadcast to the entire financial district. "Furthermore," Harrison continued, his voice carrying across the silent trading floor, "I'll be personally calling every major firm in the city to ensure they're aware of this incident. Your behavior represents exactly the kind of arrogance and client exploitation that gives our industry a bad reputation." As security moved in to escort Michael from the building, I reflected on the lesson that had just been delivered. Respect isn't earned through expensive suits or impressive offices. It's earned through how you treat people when you think they can't hurt you. The drive home was quiet, but my mind was already working on the difficult conversation I'd need to have with Laura about why her husband was suddenly unemployed and unemployable. Michael had called me a poor old fool in front of dozens of his colleagues and superiors. He'd learned too late that the only fool in that office was the one who'd assumed that age and quiet dignity were signs of weakness rather than strength earned through decades of building something real. The quiet revenge was complete, surgical, and devastating. But the real victory wasn't in destroying Michael's career. It was in knowing that Laura would eventually understand the kind of man she'd married and why some relationships need to end to protect the people you love.